Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my February wrap-up. So February was an interesting one because I went through phases of like reading an entire book in one sitting to not reading for a week and a half to reading 5 books in 1 week to not really reading at all. It was just really, it was weird. I was very, very up and down, but I did still manage to read some really good stuff, and I read 7 books last month, which is a little bit low for me. I think usually when we're not in the middle of like a global catastrophe, my TBR or my reading per month tends to be like, I don't know, 8 to 10 books. But since we've been in a pandemic, I've been reading like 10 to 12 books per month. So 7 is definitely a little bit low for me, but you can't blame me. Whatever. I am feeling the reading motivation coming back a little bit, which is really good because I have so much stuff to read. My TBR went wildly out of control again this month, despite my best efforts. You'll see that in my book haul coming up soon. But yeah, I'm really pleased with what I read. I read a lot of advanced copies, so copies of books sent by publishers. I did some reviews, which I haven't done in a long time and I'm hoping to bring back a little bit more. So yeah, it was generally a good month. It just doesn't feel like it was a good month. So I wanted to start doing something a little bit different. I am going to start talking about my DNFs in these monthly wrap-up videos because I'm very much of the opinion that just because I don't like a book doesn't necessarily mean that you won't like this book. And in both cases, these were books that I think just weren't really my cup of tea. There's nothing wrong with them. They just didn't really work for me. So I have 2 books that I DNF'd this month. I'm probably going to be DNFing a lot more because my TBR is so big and I think that it's time for me to get a little bit more aggressive with my DNFing. So I have these 2 books to talk about this month. The first one being Skyward In by Aaliyah Whiteley. So this is a new, I think it's technically a short novel rather than a novella. It's a sci-fi book that comes out in March, and I think this is going to be the perfect book for another reader that is not me. So basically we have Earth has invaded this planet, and it was kind of, there's really no resistance. So Earth takes over, and we follow, I think, several characters sort of as they're just kind of living their lives from either Earth or from this planet called Kita. So this one, I think, this was just not, I mean, it just wasn't my cup of tea. So this is a very kind of literary, very, very slow-moving novel, which is not a problem for me. I do often enjoy slow burn books, and I do often enjoy kind of the more literary side of things. But for me, I just didn't have anything that kind of hooked me into this story. I just wasn't really feeling it. And some of the stuff that was coming up in it, I was just like, I don't want to read about like a 12-year-old kid masturbating on the ground. Like, I was just so not in the mood to kind of like put up with the kind of the more literary stuff, quite frankly. So this was just not for me. There have been several people who have really, really enjoyed it. So go ahead and check out Goodreads if this was on your radar and you're not really sure if you want to pick it up or not. I think this is just one that's either going to work or it's not going to work, and it's just completely up to personal preference. Then I have Hall of Smoke by H.M. Long. This is another one where it wasn't really my cup of tea, but I think this is going to be an amazing book for people who enjoy Viking type fantasy. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. I have absolutely no idea, but there's something about kind of like Viking books that my brain just goes, nope, we're not doing this. Don't like it, don't want it. And it's just a huge mental block for me. I don't know why. I've never like, I don't know, been traumatized by a Viking book or anything like that. I've never like really read any, but every time I have tried, it's just not really gone well for me. So for example, like Sky in the Deep and Adrian Young's books just don't click with me because they're very much that kind of style. So I think maybe if you liked those, you should try picking this up. This is about a woman named Hessa who is a priestess of the war goddess, and because she ends up basically not murdering a traveler that she was supposed to murder, because when you're a priestess of the goddess of war, you do a lot of murders. She believes her entire sort of tribe of people is wiped out. So she ends up having to kind of like going and trying to find this person and end up murdering them. And I imagine it's gonna get a lot more complicated for her from there. It just wasn't clicking with my brain. I think I read about 50 or 60 pages and it just wasn't my jam, which is such a shame because I really, really, really love the author. I really like her writing style. It's just this was not my kind of fantasy. So if you like kind of the Adrienne Young Viking type books, you should maybe give this one a try. So I don't remember what order I read these in because I have been shuffling and reshuffling them over the course of the month as I've been doing things like reviews and stuff. So I am just going to go in some kind of pretend made-up order, let you know what I thought of these books and where I have full reviews where possible. So let's get started. I read a book that came out in January and I really loved. This is the one that I read in one sitting, like cover to cover, after having not really read a lot sort of previously. And this is kind of what helped me get back my motivation at the beginning of the month. This is The Shape of Darkness by Laura Purcell. Laura Purcell is a fabulous, fabulous gothic horror writer. All of her books take place in kind of the Victorian era, and they're all spooky. Sometimes there is a line of, is it supernatural? Is it not supernatural? And this definitely falls kind of in between the two. It's a really, really, really fun read. I really, really enjoyed this one. It's a really, I think it's quite an interesting one for her books because her books don't tend to deal with like straight up murder, which this one does, which was quite fun. So The Shape of Darkness follows two characters in Victorian Bath. We have Agnes, who is an aging silhouette artist, which is like this thingy just here, very popular with the Victorians, but now with photography, sort of the art is beginning to fade and she's struggling to make ends meet. She lives with her mother and her nephew, and she's kind of the only one who's bringing in any money. So she is really thrilled when someone comes and sits for her, and then she finds out that this person is murdered shortly afterwards. And this begins to become a little bit of a trend. People sit for Agnes and then they are murdered in some kind of horrible way. So in order to figure out what's going on and save her business, Agnes decides to go to a child spirit medium called Pearl to figure out what's going on, if she can contact some of the people who have departed and find out what is happening. So the other perspective that we have in this book is Pearl, who I think is like 11 or 12, and she very much has got the gift to communicate with the dead, and her sister is basically sort of taking advantage of the Victorian interest in mediums and the paranormal, and she and her sister hold seances and they contact the dead for their clients. But Pearl is definitely suffering. Her sister is a very, very sort of strict person who's in charge of her because her father is dying, her mother has passed away. So these two women's lives kind of collide in a really, really interesting way, and I really loved all of the twists and turns of this book. I loved the way that it resolved. I loved everything that happened in this. I thought it was absolutely fabulous. So if you are a fan of her books like I am, I think you will definitely enjoy this. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. Then I listened to an audiobook, so I talk about this a little bit in my March TBR because this is the very first in my sort of project to actually finish some series. It does mean that I have to actually reread some books earlier on in the series to continue said series. So I read Hyperion by Dan Simmons. This is one of my absolute favorite books ever. It's one of my favorite sci-fi books. It is the book that got me into sci-fi. I always think it was The Martian, but I actually read The Martian after this. So this is the book that really, really got me into reading science fiction, which I'd always loved as kind of a genre of film and TV, but never really clicked with for books until I read this. So it was really interesting to reread this because I think when I read this, it was the very first book that I recommended to Scottish husband, and he ended up reading it and has read the entire series, unlike me. So it would have been about 7 or 8 years ago. So my tastes had changed a lot in 7 or 8 years, so I was a little bit nervous about whether or not I would love this book as much as I originally did, and I did. It's fabulous. It's a classic of sci-fi for a reason. So Hyperion follows a group of pilgrims at the beginning of a sort of intergalactic war who are going on this pilgrimage to this planet called Hyperion. They all have some kind of link or connection to the planet, but none of them know each other. They're going to go on this pilgrimage to this place called the Time Tombs, and on the way there, they decide that they are going to share their stories as to what led them to this point and what they kind of hope to achieve from this pilgrimage. It's basically the Canterbury Tales set in space, which is fabulous. I absolutely love that whole concept, and it works really, really, really well in this book. I just absolutely love this. It's such a fabulous read. The audiobook is really good. I've had the audiobook in my library for a long time because I have been wanting to reread this for ages, and yeah, it's just as good as it was the first time. I absolutely loved it. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. In case you can't tell, I'm really looking forward to reading The Fall of Hyperion in March. It's on my March TBR. It's gonna happen, and I'm so pumped. Then I read The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. This came out in January, and it's one that I have been muscling through for a very long time. I did a full review of this book, so I'm not going to really dive into it here, but I had a very mixed reaction to this. There were some parts of it that I loved so much, but overall it left me feeling a little bit meh. I thought that it was overly long, overly complicated, but I loved the characters, some of my favorite characters ever. So I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars, which kind of feels like a very, very fair rating in terms of how much I loved a lot of the stuff, despite the fact that a lot of it did disappoint me. You'll see a lot more in my review. I'll link it up above so you can go ahead and check it out. Next up is a book that I was so excited to get my hands on, and it was a really, really lovely read. This is Remote Control by Nnedi Okorafor. I have really loved her writing ever since I read Binti, which I've now read twice, a very rare reread for me, and I need to finish that series. Go figure. But I was very excited to hear she had a new novella coming out. I think this came out in late January or early February, but it was a little tough to get my hands on here in the UK. I finally managed to, thanks to indie bookstores. Hurrah. And I really loved it. It's a really, it's a very sad and quiet, but really wonderful story. In this book, we follow a girl named Fatima at 2 different points in her life. So when she is a very, very young child, and then when this sort of incident happens, she gains this incredible power, completely forgets her name, so she goes by Senfoka. So if I use either name, it's the same person. And she becomes known as Death's adopted daughter. So this great power that she sort of unintentionally sort of inherits or gains is basically the power to kill people without touching them, whether it is intentional or otherwise. So she's a very, very little girl when she ends up sort of gaining this power, and horrible things happen to her, but she kind of begins to wander and begins to kind of just sort of experience life as a very, very lonely young girl who people are absolutely terrified of. It's very light on the sci-fi elements, although this is definitely a sci-fi story. So if you're looking for something that goes really hardcore into sci-fi and kind of explains what this power is and what all this sort of stuff going on in the background is, I don't think you're really gonna get that, but it's a really, really great in-depth character study of this girl as she's growing up completely alone and in this totally bizarre circumstance. So I really enjoyed this one. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, and I would definitely recommend it. Then I read a book that I absolutely adored. This is Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. This is another one where I have a full review, so go ahead and check out the review. I've linked it up above. But this is a lovely book. I was so excited to read this, and it did not let me down. This is one of the very, very rare kind of cozy sci-fi books that I've ever read. And it was so nice to get that. Sci-fi is not the coziest genre, but of course we have Becky Chambers, and there's not really a lot else. So having something like this sort of fall into that category was really, really awesome. So this follows 2 men. One is a prince and one is kind of an ambassador for his people, and they end up being forced into an arranged marriage after one of their husbands has passed away. Basically, the fate of the empire relies on the 2 of them getting along and sort of showing that this marriage is working because of treaty negotiations. I talk about it in my review. And it's really a look at two people who are complete strangers who begin to fall in love in this very, very unusual circumstance. First half is definitely character focused. Second half leads much more into plot. But it was wonderful. I really, really loved it, and I liked the way that it was kind of constructed in that way. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. If you want to see more, you can check out that video. Then I read a new novella by one of my favorite sci-fi authors. This is One Day All This Will Be Yours by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a very small little novella. It comes out on Thursday as of the recording of this video on the 4th. So you can go ahead and pick it up then. I really recommend you do because it is a equally dark and bleak but very, very, very funny book, and it's all about time travel and how humans just completely fuck it up. So this takes place at the very end of something called the Causality War, and our main character is a veteran of that war, the war that broke time, and he has basically set up shop at the very, very, very sort of end point of time. He has this lovely farm, he has a thing for like Soviet era tractors, and he hangs out all day with his pet dinosaur, and he sort of stops time travelers from getting past that point and sort of takes them out of the picture so that people can't screw shit up again and again and again because he has seen all this horrible stuff happening. It's really, 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 really good. I don't want to say anything more than that, but if you've read his other novellas, so Walking to Aldebaran is the one that kind of comes to mind for me. It's very much in that same vein of really, really darkly funny, really clever, and has lots of really good twists and turns. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. I really, really, really enjoyed this, and I really want to go back and read the rest of his novellas that he did for Solaris, these like little tiny hardback novellas, because I've read one of them, Walking to Aldebaran, and I think there are 2 others that I've missed out on. So I really, really want to go back and see if they are just as fun as this. And the very last book that I read in the month of February, I got a little bit of a head start on some of my summer reading. You put a Becky Chambers book on my Kindle, it's gonna get read. So this is A Psalm for the Wild, built by Becky Chambers. This comes out in July, and it's the first of her new series, the Monk and Robot series. And I really, really enjoyed this. I'm very curious to see what fans of her Wayfarers books think of this, because it is quite different, although it does still have that kind of cozy sci-fi feeling. This is definitely more of a book that blends the lines of sci-fi and fantasy in my head, because it's got robots and stuff, but also it just has like the feeling of like a Studio Ghibli movie. And it feels like fantasy. So this will be really, really interesting to see what people think. In this book, we follow a character named Sibling Dex, who is feeling very, very unfulfilled with their life, and they decide they're going to find a new vocation, which is basically to become a tea monk. A tea monk gets in their wagon, rides around the country, and sets up almost like a mobile tea shop, and they serve as kind of like mobile tea shop and bartender and therapist. Basically, they'll brew you a lovely cup of tea. You can talk about your problems. You can sort of like escape your life for an hour or however long. And they end up becoming very, very good at this, but they're still feeling kind of unfulfilled. So they decide to go off into the wilds to try to find this old like hermitage that has been long since overgrown, because out in the wilds that land has been claimed by robots who basically at some point turned to their human masters and said, you know, we don't really want to do this anymore. We don't want to be forced labor, so we're gonna leave. And they leave. So while out in the wilds, they encounter one of these robots, and it ends up being a very philosophical book. It's another one of hers that's a little bit light on plot. It doesn't have a lot of the sci-fi vibes that her other books do. It took me a little bit to get into it. I was actually really, really, really worried that this was going to be the first Becky Chambers book that I didn't like. However, it takes a little bit of time to grow on you. So I ended up really, really enjoying this book by the end. I'm very curious to see what other people think of it. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and if you've read this already, I would really, really, really love to hear what you thought. So that is it for my February wrap up. I had a really strong reading month, although I wish I had read a little bit more. but sometimes pandemic brain just won't let you. So I would love to know in the comments below what you managed to read in the month of February, if you have read any of these books, or if they are in your TBR. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.